talking about the relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU after Brexit. Simon's very well qualified to speak about this subject. He's the Harold Laski Professor of Political Science at the London School of Economics, where he's also a pro-director for research. He's a fellow of the British Academy. He's published a lot of books on the EU, including What's Wrong with the EU, so it's not all starry-eyed. But he is also about to, one might say vote with his feet, but he can tell me if that's unfair, and become the Stein-Rocken Chair in Comparative Politics at the European University Institute in Florence, where he did his doctorate. So Simon's going to talk for about 35 or 40 minutes. If you're joining us live rather than on YouTube, you can ask questions in the Q&A function, and I will take questions and get through as many as I can after he's given his talk. So welcome, Simon. Thank you very much. I'm sorry you're not here in person, but welcome virtually to Mansfield.
Helen, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I prepared some slides because I prefer to speak with some slides. So I'm going to share my screen now. Can everybody see that? Can you see that, Helen?
Yes, can.
So I'm going to talk about UK-EU relations going forward, how I see it. I'm going to mainly talk about some big picture issues relating to the impact of Brexit in the short term and how that might play out in our relations with the EU going forward. I'll also say a little bit about Scotland, because inevitably on these sort of public talks, people always ask me, what's going to happen with Scotland? So I'm going to say a little bit about Scotland as well. So of course, the relationship has not started well. It didn't take long. It just within a couple of weeks of us formally ending the transition period, immediately we saw some pretty nasty politics emerging. So you might ask yourself, is this the sort of teething problem, or is this going to be a permanent feature? I actually think nasty politics between the UK and the EU is going to be a permanent feature, or at least a feature for quite a long time to come, I'm afraid. The fact that there is a deal actually means, and we signed a deal with the EU, means we have a pretty good basis on which to start to build a new framework. And you've got to see the deal itself, the trade and cooperation agreement, in the sense that the sort of the beginning of the next step, if you like. It's the end of the start of the Brexit process. Brexit starts now, and it's not done. So Brexit is never, ever going to be done. So don't pretend Brexit is done. It's going to be a permanent, ongoing process and a permanent feature of British politics. And there will be bumps in the road, and there will be constant tensions between the UK and the EU along the lines of the type of things we've seen here with these headlines. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why do we have the deal that we have, because I think that helps us understand what's feasible going forward if we're trying to think about what might change in the deal. Why do we have this particular equilibrium, this bargaining outcome between the UK and the EU? And if it is an equilibrium, then it's going to be hard to change. So I don't think that it's going to be easy to change going forward. So that's the sort of background we're thinking about. Where do we go from here? Because we've got to think about what are the economic and political implications of that deal domestically in the UK, but also for the EU. And will those things be destabilizing that will fundamentally change the relationship going forward? Are we likely to see the UK drift backwards, start to rebuild bridges back to the EU, or are we likely to see the UK drifting further out into the Atlantic towards the US, if you like, or as some people would like, perhaps towards the Pacific? I'm then going to say a little bit about Scotland and Northern Ireland, because I think the relationship with Scotland and Northern Ireland is not just a internal British thing. I think how the union plays out and the politics of Scottish independence and the politics of Northern Ireland, I think will have an influence on how the UK relates to the EU and relates to the UK. I'll also say a little bit about, will other countries leave the EU? I'm going to be quite controversial and say, I think they might. So immediately the deal was done, the Commission quite provocatively put out a little slide or a little ready reckoner to help us understand what was in the deal, so you could contrast it with what was the deal with EU membership. It's a little provocative, but I think it does what is in the deal. So, you get some visa-free access, 0 tariffs on goods, very little on services, a few little things on air transport and road transport, but it's essentially a deal that is about removing tariffs and quotas on the free movement of goods. Called a trade and cooperation agreement. People like to call it a free trade agreement, but one thing you've got to understand about free trade agreements is there's not a lot that's actually free in a free trade agreement. It just means there aren't There's a subset of goods and services on which we've removed tariffs and quotas. There's still customs checks, there's still regulatory checks, there's still lots of form filling, there's still lots of what we call non-tariff barriers. These are barriers to the free movement of goods. And the only genuine free trade is the trade within a single market like the EU or within the single market of the United States. So you can think that international agreements between markets, between the EU and some other country, or between the US and another country, are not, we shouldn't actually call them free trade agreements, they're misleading. We should call them regulated trade agreements. So the UK has signed a regulated trade agreement with the EU that says there are some things we trade with each other where we're just going to have customs and regulatory checks. There's a lot of other things we trade with each other where there are going to be quotas and tariffs. And there's some things we trade with each other, like services, that aren't even really mentioned in the deal. So this is a fundamental transformation of our relationship with the market that we trade about 50% of our goods and services with. I think this is the timeline that comes from a report by the Institute of Government. You probably can't read it, it's small. I wanted to put it up there to illustrate that the implementation of this agreement that we have with the EU is permanent. So it's not like you've done it, this is the deal, then we're done. There's many, many stages of the implementation of it, and all the way up to 2028. So in 2025, there's going to be a 5-yearly review of the deal to see if bits and pieces should be negotiated. I've also highlighted here, by the end of March 2021, there's meant to be a memorandum of understanding on financial services. There's also the end of the 3-month exemption period for trade, East and West regulatory checks on trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So you can see this is implementing the deal is going to be a permanent feature of politics, the partnership between the UK and the EU. This is also from that same report by the Institute of Government, also very small. You don't need to read the small print. You just have to see lots of boxes. Each of these boxes is a committee. Lots and lots of committees that are there to implement the deal. We've left the EU, but haven't actually cut the umbilical cord, if you like. We are going to be deeply, deeply embedded in the governance of the EU, and the EU is going to be deeply embedded of our own governance of how this deal is going to affect many, many sectors of our economy and our society. So the point here I want to make is Brexit is an ongoing permanent feature of our diplomatic relationships and our political relationship with the continent. So moving on to then think about, why do we have then this basic free trade agreement? Why is it just a free trade agreement and not something more than that? And if this then is the deal they've done, how movable is it? Under what conditions might we move to something different in the medium term, say after 5 years when the TCA deal comes up for review? Here what I've got that comes from an article I wrote a couple of years ago. I was thinking about what are all different types of alternative arrangements we could get at the end of Brexit. One of them is a basic FTA, which is just what we call the Canada model. So this is a free trade agreement covering mainly goods. An FTA plus is really a basic free trade agreement plus a deal that covers services. And that was what Britain originally wanted. We're a services sector economy, 80% of our economy is in services. The UK said originally we want an FTA plus, or if you like, an FTA plus, 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 plus. We've ended up with a basic FTA. Why didn't we get the pluses? Another potential alternative that was being discussed at the beginning was the European Economic Area. The UK staying in the customs union, staying in the single market, continuing with the free movement of people like Norway. This would be the softest of the soft version of Brexit. This was off the cards from the beginning because it would have meant accepting the free movement of people. One possibility that was being flagged was an EEA minus. So, we give up some regulatory sovereignty in return for controlling the free movement of people. The EU rejected these out of sight from the beginning. If you remember the sort of Barnier staircase, Barnier said, you can only take off the shelf the type of deals the EU already has. You can take the Norway model, or you can take a basic free trade agreement. We called it the Canada model, but if you're the EU, this was like the agreement with Canada, or the agreement with South Korea, or now the agreement with Japan. Basic FTA or the EEA. So the EU said, basic FTA or EEA. Given that choice, the UK inevitably had to choose the basic free trade agreement. They were never offered the FTA plus. and they were never going to accept an EEA. So we've ended up with this very relatively bare bones free trade agreement with lots of non-tariff barriers on the free movement of goods and nothing on services. Take to shift from this, you could say, well, maybe we could move in the medium term back to the European Economic Area. This would require a fundamental shift in domestic politics in Britain. We'd have to accept giving up a lot of our regulatory sovereignty, to accept EU regulations, to accept ECJ jurisdiction, and we'd have to accept the free movement of people. Very unlikely, you might say now, but I can imagine a politics playing out in Britain where perhaps a different government might come in and say, we want a softer version of Brexit. The impact of Brexit, the economic impact has been huge. We want actually to row back a little bit and get closer to the EU and do some kind of deal to reform the EEA in some way. From the EU side, I actually think there is a possibility of movement in the other direction towards that plus on financial services. It's mentioned in the TCA, and there is a possibility of a deal on financial services, unlikely to give the banks in Britain passporting rights, which is rights to sort of sell their goods and services all across the EU. But I think there is a possibility. What tends to happen with the EU is they tend to play hardball at the beginning because they don't want to set any dangerous precedent of the original deal, and then they allow add-ons. This is exactly what happened with Switzerland, and the relationship with the UK may well be similar. We may be able to get some add-ons to the deal, and one of these add-ons could be for financial services, but we will have to pay for it. There will have to be some side deal that's done to force the UK either to accept regulatory equivalence of EU rules in this area, or some other side payment to allow it. Very unlikely that we're going to end up over here in the medium term, because this would be a disaster for the EU. The idea that you can be in the single market and accept free movement of goods, services, and capital, but not have free movement of people. The EU, I don't think, will ever allow that. They don't allow that for Switzerland. They don't allow that for Norway. They worry that if they did allow that, there could be a domino effect of other member states that might want to leave. Perhaps we'll come back to that in the Q&A. So we have this basic bare bones deal. It is likely to have a major impact economy. In fact, the estimates so far by various different economic models is that the impact of Brexit so far over the last 3 years, compared to the counterfactual of how the economy would have performed in absence of Brexit, it's already had an impact of about 2.5% of British GDP. And so this is losses in foreign direct investment, uncertainty about the future of the British economy, and people saying we invest in the UK, loss of supply chains, people, changes in economic behavior and so on. So already we've seen an impact of estimating around 2%. We're likely to see another impact of around about 7% of GDP. So we're a pretty wealthy country, but 7% of GDP is pretty significant. It's going to play out over a long time. This was a Treasury report themselves by the economists in the Treasury, who were hoping, they were employed by the government to come up with some estimates. They tried to get the estimates as low as they possibly could, but their economic models learned from all other trade relations across the world where they've modeled things. What's interesting here is not just the numbers. What's interesting is also the shading and the size of these. So that blue or white crosshatch here is estimated effect non-tariff barriers. So these are red barriers. These are barriers that prevent you from trading goods without you, when you have to fill in, get regulatory tax, it slows things down, it adds to your production costs, it reduces your competitiveness and so on. The estimated effect of that is around 2.5% of GDP. There's an estimated effect of customs costs of almost 2% of GDP, an effect of declining migration from the EU. And above the line, you see that tiny little sliver above the line? These are the expected economic benefits of getting freedom from the Brussels regulatory framework and the expected economic benefits of signing new trade deals with countries across the rest of the world. They just trade. I once asked my colleague Swati Dhingra in the economics department at LSE, who's a world-leading trade economist, and she said, Simon, we've been studying trade economics for about 100 years. If there's one we know, it's that what predicts trade is geography. You trade with people who are close to you. No matter what you trade with people close to you. And the volume of trade, we will be trading, our biggest trading partner is going to be the EU 27 for here on out. It's going to be substitute loss in that trade with the US, let alone trade with the Pacific. Get to the next slide here. Meanwhile, on the EU side, the estimated economic effect is relatively minor. So this is from the EU's own modeling. On the other side, they were modeling the no deal option and the FTA option. We've ended up with the FTA option. Their estimate is actually slightly lower in terms of its impact on the British economy, 3.5%. Interestingly, Ireland, they're also expecting to take a hit. For everybody else in the EU, it's a rounding error. There'll be a relatively small hit. They won't really feel it. I'm struggling with my mouse here. Hold on. So that's the sort of economic hit. Now, you might think, okay, this is just an effect of goods and services. Can we do something for our services sector? What can we do for our services sector? Services sector, we're a services economy. The focus of the debate on fishing, on some of the smaller sectors of our economy will contribute very small amounts to the economy, small amounts to the exchequer. Our big sectors are financial and business services, around 10% of our economy, about 14% of tax revenue, and creative industries. We've almost had no discussion about creative industries. It's our second largest sector of the economy. That's just not counting higher education, and I often think we should count higher education in there. This is film, fashion, TV, advertising, art, design, architecture, gaming. Sorry, what happened to my camera? But let me put the camera. Yeah, there we go. Gaming. We are world leading in these sectors of the economy. They are likely to be really badly affected by Brexit. I've got two firms down here. Vivendi Universal, you may probably heard of. That's the world's largest film and TV production company. Its European headquarters are in High Street, Kensington in London. They will not be able to run their European operations out of their European headquarters in High Street, Kensington, London, because they don't know whether they're going to be able to have rights to be able to bid for contracts to produce TV or film on the continent, to move film crews around, to move actors around. They may as well just move their offices or run a lot of their contracts out of their offices in Paris rather than London. So you can immediately see a lot of loss of business, shift of people from London to Paris. SMC, this is a design company run by a friend of mine called Andy. This is an interior design of cruise ships company. London is the world capital for interior design of cruise ships. We don't make the cruise ships anymore, but we design them in London, Andy tells me. 3 or 4 of the world's major companies are all here in London. Why? Because we have flights to everywhere in the world. We're English speaking. We have access to the talent pool of European designers, he says. What he needs from Brexit is to be able to hire people very quickly and very easily for relatively short-term contracts. If you're building a ship, you need, swimming pool designers, restaurant designers, nightclub designers, bedroom designers, everything you can get and be able to do it quickly and do it flexibly. He's worrying about whether or not London can remain competitive in a European market post-Brexit in these sorts of sectors. There's been very little discussion about this. I do think very quickly on the table is going to be discussions about these firms getting access fairly to EU procurement markets, and also they're being able to get talent from the EU. So I think we should start to discuss, for example, an EU-UK high-skilled work visa, a bit like the American green card, perhaps an EU-UK blue card scheme for high-skilled workers, so people who are highly skilled can move around freely within our corner of the world. The British government says we don't want to do any special deal on migration with the EU, but inevitably it's our closest market. It's our closest market for people, for goods and services. And in a services economy, services are people. And the ability of people to move around, the ability of people to offer their services, provide their services, and consume services, this is going to be about the movement of high-skilled labour. So I think this is going to be one of the major things that's going to be on the agenda quickly. I'll skip over this one quickly. This is the estimated impact on financial services. We're already seeing a shift of financial services out of London, but this tells you that we may see up to a 30% loss of the wholesale financial services markets in London. This was one of the estimates here. We saw the news, I think today, that Yesterday, it was the first trading day where there was a higher volume of trade in European stocks in Amsterdam than in London for the first time. You might say people in Britain want to see a shift away from financial services, but the worry that is a leveling down rather than a leveling up. Financial services, we might not like these what you might think of as selfish bankers. They generate wealth, they generate tax revenue that gets spent on things like the NHS. So we've got this big economic hit, but the British public doesn't look like it's changed its mind much throughout this Brexit process, despite how difficult this process has been, despite growing realization of the economic costs, despite the frustrations people have had at different stages and the internal shenanigans going on in Westminster, the British public has hardly changed its mind. One of my favorite questions is a YouGov question that they ask almost every week. In hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? You can see since around about mid-2017, slightly more people have said they thought the UK was wrong to vote to leave the EU than people who said they were right. The latest polls from this week, on the 3rd of February, last week, shows only a 2% gap. 45% said wrong, 43% said right. I expect we're going to see them flipping over. People will get used to Brexit. They'll price it in. They'll say it's normal. They'll look at the UK performing well on the vaccines. They'll look at the EU performing badly on vaccines. And I think we may see this go the other way. I'll come back to this in a second. We have seen some change, though, and it tends to be not leavers changing their mind. It tends to be don't knows from the referendums who are now saying, no, we were wrong. I wish I'd voted Remain. And it tends to be generational replacement. It tends to be those younger voters who weren't able to vote in the referendum, now are able to vote, tend to be more pro-European than those older voters who have passed away over the last 4 years. So we have seen a major shift in British politics away from party identities to Brexit identities. So this was identified by my colleagues Sarah Hobart and James Tilley up there in Oxford. They have argued in a series of papers that actually when you ask people what are the main things they care about most, how do they identify in politics, more people now identify as a Leaver and a Remainer than as a Labour voter or a Conservative voter. It may be because we've just had Brexit and we've had 4 years of this Brexit process, and this might fade away. But if I'm right, and the battle with the EU is going to carry on, or the EU will be a permanent feature of our politics going forward, Leave Remainer may be replaced with pro-European, anti-European, or soft relationship, hard relationship, or closer relationship, further relationship. I think these identity forming relationships will carry on, and I think they may well supplant our traditional party political identities. And in fact, in the last election in 2019, the last general election in the UK, this was a big predictor of people who switched votes. So we saw a big switch of votes in a lot of those northern seats from Labour to Conservative. They were overwhelmingly Leave voters switching from Labour to Conservative. And equally, in some of those cities in the south and towns in the south, it tended to be Remain voters switching from Conservative to Labour the other way. So we've seen a realignment. Back in 2016, there was something like 1/3 of Labour voters were pro-Leave, 2/3 Remain, and about 1/3 of Conservative voters were pro-Remain and 2/3 Leave. Now, it's around about 80 to 90% of those voters are Remainers who are Labour and Leavers who are Conservative. So we've seen a realignment of party identities to match up with those Brexit identities, and that's going to be very difficult to shift going forward. Meanwhile, it's difficult to explain this slide, but I think it's an important one. Let's think about the longer term trajectory of British public opinion. And why I put this up, this shows support for EU membership amongst EU member states and their closest comparable non-EU member state. So if you think about this, this is the net support for the EU minus opposition to the EU. And you can look, if you roll back to the mid-1990s and compare Sweden and Norway. Sweden and Norway at this time voted on whether they would join the EU. Sweden, by a majority, voted to join. Norway voted not to join. And look at the trajectory since then. Compare Austria and Switzerland. in the late 1990s. Similarly, Austria voted to join, Switzerland voted not to join, and look at the trajectories. When you're outside the EU, I remember it was the Swiss ambassador who came and gave a seminar at the LSE, and he said, I've got two messages for you from the view of Switzerland. One, he said, EU will not go away. It's going to be a permanent feature of your politics. Two, your public will become increasingly anti-European because the EU is an immovable beast, and every time you try and change things, you are going to lose, and the EU is going to rub your face in it. And your public is going to become more and more anti-European over time. And that's what has happened in Switzerland. And I fear that's the same thing that will happen in the UK. Finally, I'll say a few things about Scotland and about Northern Ireland. Will we see Scottish independence? So on the one hand, of course, Brexit is a boon for the SNP. It's very easy for Nicola Sturgeon to make the case that Scotland, the Scottish people who overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU, are being dragged out of the EU against their will by the nasty English. So that's a very nice case. And you can see that reflected in the polls. You can see this is support for independence, yes and no. And you can see actually since COVID and the performance of the Scottish government compared to the English government, you can see very much the support now shifting significantly in favor of, with a majority in favor of Scottish independence. This is the longest continuous majority in support of Scottish independence since these polls have been conducted, and they've been conducted since around 2012. However, it may be much harder to argue for Scottish independence with the UK outside the EU than inside the EU. Because if the UK is inside the EU, you can have Scottish independence without you really noticing it. So when you think about it, you can say, well, we're going to be in the single market. There'll be no customs checks, no regulatory checks, no border checks. We can keep the Queen, we can keep the pound, we can keep the passport authority if you want. We can keep, we'll just have a little bit of tax independence. You won't really notice it. You would really notice it now. All it's going to take is Westminster to say, I tell you what, we're going to have a border. Why don't we call it Hadrian's border? And we're going to have customs checks and regulatory checks. Suddenly, Scottish independence is going to be a much harder sell. And you're going to start to see a change in the nature of the politics about Scottish independence. We're already starting to see it. So we had a report from a team of trade economists at LSE that did a series of reports on Brexit and the economic effects of Brexit. And they've done a similar report where they've looked at the potential economic effects of Scottish independence. So they said for Scotland, the impact of Brexit is around about 2% of GDP. Any form of independence, in addition to Brexit, is going to lead to between 6 and 9% effect on Scottish GDP, a major economic hit. This is based on modeling, classic trade modeling. Interestingly, I love Michael Gove's reaction to this. In 2016, when these guys had the same report on the economic effects of Brexit, Gove said, people in this country have had enough of experts. Immediately after this report came out, he said, oh, look, independence would cost Scotland far more than Brexit study finds. We're going to see all the arguments of Scottish independence reversed. All those people who claimed you could leave the EU customs union and regulatory union and you wouldn't need a border between the UK and Northern Ireland or between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland because we could do it through technology, are now saying you would have to have a border between Scotland and England. All of those people who said you would have to have a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are now saying, oh, technology can fix a border between Scotland and England. So it's going to be fun to watch these people flipping sides exactly on the debate about Scottish independence. Finally, you can't talk about Brexit and UK's relationship with the EU without talking about Northern Ireland. So we have the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Northern Ireland Protocol was an effort to fix, to resolve this trilemma. I'm not the only person who's talked about this. Many people have come up with this idea, called it in different ways, but it's a classic trilemma. And the idea of a trilemma is you can have any two of these goals, but you can't have all three. And so you can think about what the goals are. The first one is the UK outside the customs union and the single market, which is what the Brexiteers have always wanted, leaving the single market and the customs union. You can say, I don't want a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. That would undermine UK unity. Or you can say, we don't want a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland because that would undermine the Good Friday Agreement. So you can't have all three of these things. All three of these things is cloud cuckoo land. You could have the UK not leaving the customs union, the single market, and therefore there wouldn't be no border east-west and no border north-south, but you would have what Jacob Rees-Mogg described as the UK being a vassal state of the EU. Or you could have no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and UK outside the customs union, which we currently have, and you end up with what is going on right now, which is you have undermining of the unity between the UK, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And I do think you've got a choice here, difficult choice. Either you have a solution which is going to significantly anger the Republicans and the Catholic population in Northern Ireland, or you're going to have a solution that will undermine and significantly anger the Protestant population in Northern Ireland. And it's the latter which is the solution that we've got. I do worry about its sustainability, and I do think we are heading at some point, it's going to be very difficult to resist at some point, either a border poll or some significant conflict between the UK and the EU trying to find a different solution to Northern Ireland. I don't see a different solution, I'm afraid. Finally, on the EU side, I said I would talk about whether or not I thought any member state would leave the EU. On the one hand, you can say Brexit has been a boon to the EU. Since Brexit, there's been growing support for EU integration, however you measure it, in national opinion polls, the Eurobarometer EU polls, however you measure it, everywhere across the EU, there's been growth in support for the EU. If you like, the public across Europe has woken up to the fact that leaving the EU is difficult, painful, and costly. And what you can see here in the latest opinion polls that have just came out today, these are the polls that did in November and December all across Europe. This is the percentage of people who think their country's membership of the EU is a good thing, up to 63%. That's the highest since the early 2000s, and as a continuous trajectory since 2011, after the financial crisis, when it was down to 47. From 47 to 63 is a pretty amazing continuous growth in support. However, there's always a however. When you ask the publics across Europe, do you think another country is going to leave the EU? And this was asked back by YouGov just after the Brexit vote in September 2016. Almost everybody, almost every member state, a majority of people say yes. After Brexit, they think another country will leave the EU. None of them think their own country is going to, but they think another country is going to. Why do they think that? And this is what is interesting. I actually think now the UK has left the EU, there will be a difficult period for Britain. There'll be a difficult period. Part of it will be teething problems. Part of it will be the economic shock of Brexit. Part of it will be these battles with the EU. But in the medium term, the UK will represent an alternative model. There'll be the Swiss model of a relationship with the EU. There'll be a Norwegian model of a relationship with the EU. And there will now be a UK model of a relationship with the EU. And it will, at a certain point, it will be perceived the UK is doing better than the EU. Actually, it's amazing that that has already happened in one area, which is vaccine rollout. Already we're seeing, and it was a German politician yesterday that said, Brexit was meant to show that the UK could not do things better than the EU. And how come in the first major policy challenge that comes along, which is vaccine rollout, the UK is doing far better than the EU? So this is a real challenge already to the credibility of the EU institutions. And I do think in the medium term, this will be a boon to politicians on the populist right in several countries. The country I think to watch is going to be Sweden. Sweden is the largest economy now not in the Eurozone, in the EU, now that Britain has left. Sweden has a close relationship with the UK and with Norway, two member states that are not in the EU. Sweden has always had a very difficult relationship with political integration in Europe in the same way that the UK does. Swedish public opinion is very pro-European now, but I think it's soft and it could change quite quickly. So, where have we got to? The economic impacts that we're seeing of Brexit are not teething problems. They are structural consequences of the trade and cooperation agreement, of the basic free trade agreement that the UK has signed with the EU. And then Menon, who runs the UK and a Changing Europe program, likes to describe it as a slow puncture. The British public won't notice these economic effects, particularly when you think about the economic effects of COVID at the same time and other consequences going on in the economy. It will be a slow puncture. the economy will carry on growing, but it'll grow more slowly, and the gap will gradually emerge between the UK and the EU in terms of economic performance. There will be pressure for add-ons, and I think there's going to need to be a focus on what add-ons can we add to the treaty to help our services sector. And I think the key one there is going to be free movement of high-skilled workers, some sort of agreement, but also mutual recognition of qualifications. Relations between the EU and the UK are going to be a permanent feature of British politics, with gradually party positions solidifying around a closer to the EU or further from the EU type positions. Meanwhile, the UK public may well become increasingly Eurosceptic over time. There'll be a battle over Scottish independence. Scotland, I have a feeling the SNP will not say we want to rejoin the EU. I have a feeling the SNP are going to say we want to join the EEA. We want the Norwegian model. We don't want to be full EU members. We want to have some independence, but we're happy to accept the kind of Norway EEA to be in the single market and the customs union. Have fun spotting the hypocrisy as people switch sides in their arguments about the costs and benefits of these things. Finally, from the EU side, little evidence right now that a member state will follow the UK out. But I think in the medium term, Brexit is potentially a real existential threat to the EU. And I think there may well be at least one or maybe two other member states in the medium term who might decide to follow the UK out. That's all I got for you.
Thank you, Simon. That was a tour de force. It was not encouraging, but it was fascinating. So anyone who wants to ask Simon questions can put them in the Q&A box. Stefan and Eckelmeyer has already said that perhaps it might prevent misunderstanding and disappointment if we call the TCA an unfreeing agreement, because it's the first trade-related agreement ever with the declared aim of bringing about trade disintegration. So that's a comment really rather than a question. But I wonder if I might kick off while we wait for things to come into the Q&A box. But I was interested when you were talking about social attitudes to the EU, and you said that there was a perception that people might want to be closer to the Atlantic or closer to the Pacific. And I wonder if that's actually realistic, especially in the Biden era. Is it really a choice between being closer to Europe or closer to America or anywhere else? Or is it the fact that we will simply just lose influence and be closer to Israel?
This is, whoops, my camera just got blurred. 1 sec. There we go. I always have to be careful what I say here because, people accuse me of being anti-American. My wife and kids are American. Okay, let's just get this straight. I never felt a conflict between feeling pro-European and pro-American. I thought that was perfectly natural and normal. And it seems odd to me that we now have the sort of deep at the heart of British politics now is this idea that we have, are we going to align ourselves to Europe, which means European security interests, European attitudes towards China and Russia, European values, European regulatory standards, high environment standards, high social standards, and so on? Or do we align ourselves to American security and economic and political interests? And Britain has always had that sort of split identity between being both Anglo-Saxon and being European, and it being a tension at the heart of our identity. And I think that's the tension at the heart of Brexit. Biden, I think, interestingly, on economic issues, I think, and trade issues, his administration is going to want to deal with the EU first rather than the UK. And it's purely size. They're just mainly the potential economic benefits of an FTA between the US and the EU are just massive compared to the potential benefits of a deal with the UK. You may say it's easier to do a deal with the UK. It's just one country as opposed to 27. But at the heart of the battle over the EU-US FTA in the past was a lot of British objections about the UK drugs companies wanting to open up the drugs market in the UK rather than allowing the NHS to be a single purchaser, the hormone-injected beef or chlorine-dipped chicken and all the rest of it. So it's going to be no easier to do a deal with Britain than you. You've got only limited capacity to do it with the. On the other side, when it comes to security questions, the US is probably closer to the UK now than the EU. When you think about China, you think about Britain, the US wanting to play hardball with China, the UK increasingly having a hard line on China, The EU now looking like they're sucking up to China in some respects. They've just signed this trade and investment deal with China. They're keeping quiet about the Uyghurs. They're keeping quiet about what's going on in Hong Kong. So I do think actually on some security questions, we're seeing a transatlantic separation. So there's a difference, I think, in where Biden will be going on economics as opposed to sort of security issues.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the other thing that also struck me was you talked about growing anti-EU feeling, which I think is a very realistic proposition, and that arising from a sense that the EU is an immovable block, and that especially when you're outside, you can't change it. And it was that sovereignty discourse that was one of the powerful arguments against the EU during the referendum. And I wonder whether you think we could have changed the EU more from the inside, and whether that in time might lead to some sort of softer form of Brexit as we do try to get back into some of the policy arguments that affect who we are and how we trade.
It's a really good question. When I talk to colleagues on the continent about that, they sort of laugh at me and say, the UK already did. The UK, the perception in Paris and Berlin and Brussels is the UK won most of the institutional arguments over the last 30 years. The UK got the kind of Maastricht deal, got the opt-outs it wanted, was not in Schengen, was not in the Euro, got pretty much everything it wanted, and yet was still bleating from the sidelines. So there was a sense that, we were anti-EU, and a lot of the continent couldn't quite understand why, because the perception from Brussels is Britain had got enlargement the way it wanted it, got the single market the way it wanted it. It was a British EU in a sense. Certainly that was the view from Paris. But you raise a different question, I think, which is interesting, which is, I was actually arguing after the original Brexit referendum that what we should have done is move into the EEA temporarily. We should have gone for a quick Brexit, move into the EEA and stay there, which is a bit like the transition period, in the single market, free movement of people. And then we work with the EU to reform the EEA, to think about a collective governance architecture. Because the EEA right now is essentially Norway and the other EEA countries being, if you like, commonwealths of the EU, a bit like Puerto Rico and the US. In a sense, they have no representation in the central institutions, but they're members of the single market, free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor. They have to accept EU regulations. Bruegel, a think tank in Brussels, immediately after the Brexit debate, raised the idea of what they call a continental partnership. They said, let's come up with a new governance architecture for the single market on a continental scale of the EU member states and the non-EU member states collectively governing this single market together. And then there's a difference in a whole range of other policy areas, fishing, agriculture, free movement of people and so on, which the EU can be getting on with. But the rest of us could be members of the single market and have some say in how that single market is governed in some way. I actually think in the medium term, that's a realistic possibility. I don't think the right in British politics would ever entertain something like that. I think the left potentially could, because they'll see this as a sort of, it's a pro-European Brexit, if you like. It's saying we're not in the EU, but we're in favor of European cooperation, and we're in favor of us gaining as much as we can economically, collectively, from governing our little corner of the world. And I definitely think that that's a possibility, or certain, I think it's too early now, but I think perhaps 6 months from now, those sorts of arguments, I think, will start to be aired.
That's great. Thank you. I wonder if I can turn then to Ireland. Professor Derek McCormack is a fellow at Mansfield, and I have to ask his question because he signed my Irish passport application. He's a proper Irish citizen. But he thanks you for your informative talk, and he asks you for your thoughts on whether you think this process is, well, two questions really, linked questions. One is whether you think this process will weaken or strengthen Ireland's position within the EU. And the other one is the impact on UK-Irish relations. And just related to that, someone's asked you if you could put your Venn diagram up again. I don't know if you can, but anyway.
I can do.
Yeah.
I think it was a surprise to a lot of people. Get my camera to focus again. I think it was a surprise to a lot of people how influential Ireland was during the Brexit negotiations. It was certainly a surprise to people in London. And I think this shows that the EU does actually work well to protect the interests of some of the smaller member states. You can really see the influence of a smaller member state and the power of that smaller member state when its interests are protected by 27 together. And I think that really is very, there is a big difference. Some of the big member states often feel the EU doesn't do enough for them. But a lot of the smaller member states feel they're very protected by the EU. And I think that was a clear example. On the other side, though, I think when we saw the Commission President threaten to invoke Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol without even talking to the Taoiseach in Dublin, that I think was a wake-up call to Dublin to say, maybe those days are over. We're now back to normal EU politics, and Ireland is just another member state. I think that's a worry for Ireland going forward, because Ireland was a special member state during the Brexit negotiations. Now that we're out, now that we're at the end of the transition period, I think it's a worry for Ireland. We're back to kind of normal business. I actually think Brexit will strengthen Ireland's position vis-a-vis the UK in the kind of Anglo-Irish or UK-Irish negotiations, because Ireland now will be approaching those negotiations with the possibility of invoking the EU to potentially support them. And that's very difficult. Remember also, Ireland has the US on their side, particularly with the Biden administration. I remember how we had Nancy Pelosi visit LSE with a delegation of US congressmen. What was interesting to me is all of the US congressmen who came were either Italian Americans or Irish Americans, and all of them were anti-British and very pro-Irish. And she flew immediately from London to Dublin, and in both, she went from Berlin to London to Dublin, and in all three places, she made a point of saying, you must not upset the Good Friday Agreement, and don't think you're going to get a fast UK-US trade deal through Congress if it has any impact, any negative impact on Ireland. And I think this was a message they'd not heard in London before. It was a very powerful message, and I think the Biden administration will be talking very closely to Ireland and protecting Ireland's interests as well.
That's interesting. Can I ask you then about other countries that may be thinking about their own national interests and ways that they can benefit from Brexit? Because Marlena, who also thanks you for an interesting talk, asks you whether you think there are other European cities that could take over from London as a business centre. You mentioned Paris. Are there other places that are going to start thinking of this way? And how successful do you think they're going to be?
I mean, it's interesting. For a long time, a lot of the other European markets were not focusing on some of the sectors that the UK was highly competitive in, because they thought there's no point. Britain has got such a global comparative advantage in financial services and a huge comparative advantage actually in the creative industries. What's interesting with Brexit is they're now seeing, there might be some possibilities. So you're seeing much more creative thinking in places about how do we attract these type of sectors. So in financial services, it's Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin, Luxembourg. In the creative industries, it's Stockholm, Copenhagen, even Lisbon is being talked about. So, I mean, it's interesting how some of these creative industry sectors, film, fashion, art, design, media, just think, can we have London Fashion Week? Just imagine what that takes. London Fashion Week was one of the 3 major fashion weeks in the European fashion circuit. How do we have London Fashion Week with Brexit? How do you get all the visas for everybody lined up, all the designers? It's not going to be an easy thing to do. The costs of it are going to be massive compared to it was before. People would just jump on a Eurostar or get on a plane. You can't do that anymore if you're going to actually be providing a service, which is a legal entity. I mean, Helen, you're a lawyer, you know more about this than I do. It's not the same to travel on a tourist visa and participate in London Fashion Week. So it's going to involve, it's going to be much more difficult for this for us to maintain this. And I don't think we've thought yet. And we're starting to hear it from, the musicians from the music sector, who are saying things like, Elton John, but also plenty of other musicians, DJs, saying, I won't be able to just go to a festival and play at a festival, or I won't be able to do my European tour as easily as I used to. It's going to require a visa for every single one of those countries. There's no common European, I have to get a work permit in each of these countries. And I think there is a real possibility for cooperation across higher education and all of these creative industry sectors for us to think, what could we do to help integrate our sectors across Europe? What do we need? And I think one of the things we really do need is much easier free movement of high-skilled labour in these sectors. So I'm hoping we start to open up a conversation on that.
Yeah. Somebody's asked me I mean, just thinking about identities actually, and some of the less, you've been talking about the rational arguments one way and another, but you've also been showing social attitudes. And someone's asked whether Hungary, which didn't appear on your slides, might be a country that would leave the EU. So I guess there's that question too about authoritarian countries and their sense that people might leave either because they choose to or actually because they're forced to, because they're no longer complying with some of the fundamental requirements of EU law, like judicial independence. I mean,
we focus very much on Brexit, and Brexit being what we think is the most important issue for the EU. From the EU's perspective, Brexit is one of a whole range of major geostrategic issues that the EU has been dealing with. And of course, one of them is migration, which tends to split north versus south, but also splits east versus west. And the other one is fundamental rights and democracy. And right in the heart of the EU are two governments who are either authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, which is Hungary and Poland. And the EU is really struggling to deal with that because the EU architecture was set up to make sure people were democracies before they joined. If they then stop being a democracy once they're in the EU, there isn't much the EU can do about it, because it's very difficult actually to invoke the articles in the treaty that would allow you to punish those member states. And particularly when there's political connections, for example, in the European People's Party on the centre right, Orban sits in the European People's Party. It's a political coalition. Orban is part of that political coalition. I think this is really hugely damaging to the EU, both internally and externally, and is potentially another potential existential threat to the EU. But again, it does drive the EU towards, in the medium term, a sort of more integrated core, sort of moving towards a more federal core, federal union with a sort of fiscal union, currency union, free movement of people, common migration policies, common defense policies, common security policies. In a sense, the original 6 plus 1 or 2 others. And I think then there becomes to be a periphery that will not want to sign up to that sort of stuff. And we will end up with a 2-tier European integration process in the medium term is where I expect we'll head. And interestingly, UK will be on that, if you like, other tier, not second tier, but the different tier. And the UK could be a pole of attraction for countries like Poland, Hungary, Sweden, and potentially others.
Yeah. I'm getting some questions which relate to devolution within the UK and about the question of Scottish independence, which you raised. Lucy Gingle asked whether you think that Scotland could get some kind of deal or slightly different arrangement in the same way as Ireland has, rather than trying for independence. I suppose there's 2 sides of that. One is, would the EU ever entertain it? And the other is whether it would fit with the UK Internal Market Act and whether the UK would ever entertain it.
I don't think we would. I think there was some interesting discussions at the beginning about the sort of devolved solutions, and particularly devolved solutions around immigration potentially. So London would like free movement of people, Scotland would like free movement of people, but the rest of England doesn't. So I don't think there's going to be any flexibility of anything else in the rest of the UK, particularly when we realise how difficult it is actually to police the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so I think it's going to be very difficult to resist a referendum on Scottish independence. Yeah. We are a democratic country. There is definitely a sense that if the people want to have a referendum, let them have a referendum. I think Scotland feels politically like a very different country right now. If you spend any time in Scotland, travel to Scotland, Scottish politics is very, very different. There is a sense it's a country within the union in a way we never had that, certainly in my lifetime. And so I do think it's going to, if the SNP win a majority in spring in the Scottish Assembly elections, which they probably will, I think it's going to be very hard to resist the call for a referendum, because they'll say, we went to the voters with a mandate to say, vote for us because we want a referendum. And, they're going to say, we won, we have the mandate. How can you resist it? And I think that's going to cause a lot of tensions. And I think, this government might try and resist it, but I think the more they resist it, the more it feeds the notion that Scotland is trapped. And it's going to feed into that loop that is going to raise even more support for Scottish independence. So As I said, I don't think it's going to be perhaps as easy to win that referendum as people perhaps think. Even if there is a majority, I think it might be a difficult referendum to win. But I do think we're going to have it.
Yeah. Well, you put up some figures about the costs for Scotland of Scottish independence, but somebody's asked, I think, an important question, Annabel Walsh. How far do you think the Brexit referendum and the narrative around it was a cultural issue about British identity rather than any specific issue with the EU itself or the economic costs and benefits of the thing, which may play out in the Scottish referendum as well, I suppose?
Exactly. It was interesting because back in September 2014, when we had the Scottish independence referendum, Cameron's advisors said to him, Project Fear, run a campaign on Project Fear. Scottish independence is going to raise prices in Scotland in supermarkets. It's going to have an impact on pensions. It's going to talk about economics. And all the data and evidence at the time showed those Project Fear arguments really resonated. And they resonated particularly with lower income older voters. And lower income older voters, of course, are the most economically vulnerable if they lose their pensions, if the supermarket costs go up and so on. They then came to the Brexit referendum and his advisors said, Project Fear had worked with the Scottish referendum. Let's run a Project Fear for the Brexit referendum. And of course it failed. And it failed because the Brexit referendum was not about economics. It was about cultural identity. It was about immigration. It was about sovereignty. And people were essentially willing to say, I don't care what the costs are. I'm willing to take the risk of those costs. And I'm willing to pay those costs, even if there are costs. I'm willing to do it. That's what a lot of voters were saying. So I don't know whether it's going to be about economics or culture. Last time round, when we had the Scottish referendum, it was about economics. When we had the Brexit referendum, it was about cultural identity. I don't know with this time round. I think both of them could well play out together. If it becomes about economics, I think SNP are going to lose it. If it becomes about identity, then I think they might win it. The only caveat I would add to that is if Brexit really is perceived to be a disaster economically, then that strengthens Sturgeon's argument, because she can then run a campaign that says, vote for Scottish independence to save the Scottish economy. By rejoining the EEA, by rejoining the single market, we can get back all of those gains that Britain has lost. And so I do think the impact, the economic or perceived economic impact of Brexit at that time could play out to the advantage of the SNP on the economic issue.
Okay, I'm going to roll together the last question that's just come in with one that I'd been saving to end on. So Tim Bishop says, you've spoken a lot about the issues facing the UK and the EU due to Brexit, but do you think there's an overall approach which one side or the other should take to minimise these risks and to manage relations post-Brexit? And Dan Hall, who's a former Mansfield politics student who says it's a fantastic talk, thank you, says you probably can't answer this, but can you give us some hope? Is it, and he suggests, is that some future government joining the EEA? But, you know, where do we go from here if we're being rational?
Okay, so I remember being on a platform in Germany, in Hamburg, at the Helmut Schmidt Stiftung in Hamburg. And on the platform with me was Pascal Lamy, who's the former WTO Secretary General and Chief of Staff of Delors in the Commission. And I was talking about Brexit, and this was before the referendum. And I said, you know, I think, it was just after the referendum, look, we're going to leave. It's probably going to be a hard Brexit. And he said something very interesting. He said, Simon, look, all the reasons why the UK joined the EU in the first place are still going to be there. You're still going to have about 50% of your trade with us. You're still going to have we're still going to have close security interests, fighting terrorism, data sharing, all the rest of it. We still have shared preferences on environmental sustainability globally relative to lots of other parts of the world. We still have close cultural affinity, and we're only 22 miles apart across the channel. And you can't deny that there's still going to need to be cooperation between universities, between scientists, between businesses, within the creative industries and so on. You might pretend that you can have a hard Brexit, but all the reasons why the UK joined the EU in the first place are still going to exist, and that will pull you back. And I thought that was a very interesting perspective, which is, I do think this will pull us back. And I think people will be kicking and screaming, or some parts of the British public are going to be kicking and screaming. But I do think that the TCA, the Trade Cooperation, is the beginning of the next stage. All the discussions now are, what are the add-ons? What bridges are we going to build back?
And I am optimistic we're going to build some pretty strong bridges, as long as we can hold the politicians, we can stop the politicians from squabbling over petty things in the meantime.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Simon, for a talk that was not only fantastic, but did end up with a, after all, tomorrow is another day ending. I see the lights kind of coming up at the end. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all for joining us. If you know somebody who signed up but missed the talk, it will be up on YouTube in the next few days. Next week's Friday Public Talk, also very important and topical, perhaps more optimistic, I don't know, is Professor Sir John Bell, the Regius Professor of Medicine here at Oxford, who will be talking about our post-pandemic future and planning to prevent future pandemics. So as I said on the message I sent round to Mansfield students, watch this one for your children, even if you're far too young to think about them. But anyway, in the meantime, Simon, thank you very much indeed for a brilliant talk. And
thank you very much, Helen.
Wish you well in Florence.
Okay.
Thank
you very much, Helen.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye.